It's perfectly reasonable for people to have different points of view on things. There's this tendency in all realms when people interact to think, if you disagree with me, I'm right and you're wrong. But sometimes it's perfectly reasonable to have different points of view. A lot of my work has looked at the impact of people's core personality traits on how they think about politics. We benefit from different points of view. And so I try to encourage my own students to think critically and creatively. I try to teach them how to think, but never what to think.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. Well, I am so excited to introduce today's guest, Jeffery J. Mondak. He's a professor of political science and the James M. Benson Chair in Public Issues and Civic Leadership at the University of Illinois. His highlighted publications include Personality and the Foundations of Political Behavior, Fault Lines, Why the Republicans Lost Congress, and Nothing to Read, Newspapers and Elections and a Social Experiment. His most recent research on misinformation was published recently, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. Jeff is also a poet and a songwriter with over 200 poems and songs for children. His work has been played on NPR's All Things Considered and several children's music programs, and he's been awarded a letter of merit from the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, as well as Physics Song of the Month by the American Association of Physics Teachers. And we're going to talk a little bit about what he's learned creating content for young people that maybe all of us can take back when we're thinking about how we cut through the noise in today's environment to get the right information to the right people. So Jeff, you have been called many things, from poet to songwriter to obviously a very lauded professor, but today we're excited to call you a chief influencer. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm really interested in starting out with this new research. Your name has been in the headlines because you conducted some research that is, I'd say, a bit disconcerting. Half of Americans don't know the difference between what a fact is and what an opinion is. Wow, okay. So should we be surprised by that or maybe scared?
I think we should be a little bit surprised and maybe quite a bit disturbed by it. My co-author, Matt Metler, and we published the paper in the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, and we wanted to know, could people tell the difference between a statement of fact and a statement of opinion? And so we ran a big survey, and we told the respondents what we meant by a statement of fact, which is it's a claim that could be proved to be true or false with objective evidence. Like if I said you could make the color green by mixing the colors yellow and blue, we could prove that. We could go get some yellow and blue paint, mix them, and see if green is the result. On the other hand, a statement of opinion depends on your own values, preferences, interpretations. So if I say green is the most beautiful color, that can't be proved true with objective evidence. It just depends on what you value. So we defined this for our respondents. Then we asked them 12 questions. And their job was to say, that's a statement of fact or that's a statement of opinion. And 47% of the respondents did know better than chance. You would get 6 of the 12 right on average randomly just by flipping a coin on each question. 47% of our respondents did not do any better than chance. That's pretty concerning given the nature of the information world that we all live in and how important it is for us to be able to navigate that world successfully.
So were there any commonalities about the people who were less likely to tell the difference? I mean, what conclusions can we draw from this?
We decomposed the wrong answers into two different forms of wrong answer. One is people who just were not very good at this. They were answering kind of randomly, they didn't know, and they were uninformed and unable to implement this distinction. The other people were people who were driven by their biases. And so these were all questions that involve politics and society in some form. And our concern was that people might have a tendency to say, well, if I think it, I believe it, then it's a fact. And if I disagree with it, then it's an opinion. And we found both of those types of error, and they were both pretty prevalent. The first type we can do something about. We found that as education levels go up, civics knowledge, current events knowledge, analytical ability, people did better. And so as an educator, I know what to do about that. I can coach people to be more discerning, and I can try to elevate information processing skills, and they'll do better. The second type is rooted in partisan bias. In our case, it could be rooted in other forms of bias with different questions. And that's a lot harder problem to solve, because how do we all get past our own biases? Don't let our biases get in our way and cause us to make suboptimal decisions.
So we can educate people when they're younger about the difference. But once they're baked, they're farther along in life, it's a lot harder. I mean, do you have any ideas for, does the research, this research or other research you've done, give us any indication of what we could do?
One of the things we're trying on a new survey, Matt Metler, my co-author, and I are trying this on a new survey, is to have people answer fact opinion questions about matters that are current events, not related to politics, this sort of peripheral tangential things, who has the most Grammy awards, things like that, and take that as a coaching exercise where they get used to the task. So their biases shouldn't get in their way there, because these are just things that people claim out in the world. Have them do that first before we hit them with the social and political questions. And we're hoping to find that that will make people more mindful of their biases, that they'll understand the task and be able to turn the dial down on their partisan preferences. But we don't know yet how successful, or if at all, that will succeed.
Now, I know you didn't, you don't have data from like 100 years ago on this, but like, what's your instinct? Do you think that this is worse than it used to be, better than it used to be, the same? I mean, we've always had people who, believed things that weren't true. So, I mean, do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, I would say it's not better than it used to be. Whether it's the same or worse is a tough call. We're talking about basic psychological tendencies. I'm a political scientist who studies political psychology, but a psychologist might study the same phenomenon in virtually any application. And people have a tendency to prefer psychological comfort. They want to be on the side of truth and right, and not be on the side of something that is wrong. And so they reconstruct the world. They reconstruct the facts around them to make themselves feel better about their stances that they take. And that happens when if I like that statement, well, then it's a fact. If I don't like it, it can't be true. That must be an opinion. If that's a general tendency, then it's probably existed in humans for the entire history of humankind. What we do have more of now is the information environment kind of preying on that tendency. We have more misinformation. We have more blurring of the line between fact and opinion out in the information world, which puts regular people at an even bigger disadvantage, which means that helping us counter that becomes more important today.
Did you see any consistency based with people who might be younger versus older, or they get their news from social media or cable news? I mean, you mentioned if they're more educated, more civically engaged, so they're probably bigger news consumers. Maybe more newspaper readers are savvier on this. But I'm wondering if there's anything deeper than that. Is cable news making this problem worse, for example?
It very likely is. And the way we constructed our measures, they were partisan balanced, where half of the questions favored Democrats, half favored Republicans, and half were statements of fact and statements of opinion. The real world may not have that partisan balance. The one thing that I can say is that it's not just being a Democrat or a Republican, it's being an affectively biased and emotionally biased, intensely biased Democrat or Republican that gets you in trouble. Because once you start to think of partisanship as an identity rather than a way of thinking, and your who you are as a person is tied up in my side is right and the other side is wrong, that leads you down the path of getting questions like these incorrect.
So we've zoomed into some very specific research that you've done lately, but to zoom back out, your expertise is political psychology, and you're one of the foremost experts, I believe, in terms of that topic and what influences people. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what have you learned from that field? What should we know? Whether our listener might be, the head of communications for an organization that's trying to influence policy, or a CEO in a large organization, and they want to make sure that they're getting their vision and their goals communicated effectively out to their workforce, or any other number of sort of archetypes that we could construct. What are some just key lessons from your research and your work that you would want leaders to know?
I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind that there is this distinction that we were just talking about between what is factual and what's a matter of interpretation. And approaching it from the opposite perspective of what we were just discussing, it's perfectly reasonable for people to have different points of view on things. There's this tendency in all realms, when people interact, to think, if you disagree with me, I'm right and you're wrong. But sometimes it's perfectly reasonable to have different points of view. A lot of my work has looked at the impact of people's core personality traits on how they think about politics. And I'll give you an example from some research, not of mine, but of a biologist who was studying extroversion in fish. So she was studying whether fish varied in how introverted or extroverted that they were. And she found this school of fish, and she's diving and watching this school of fish. And some were big and bold, and they were out swimming around, and they were clearly more outgoing, more extroverted. Others were hiding behind the rock and not really going out and encountering the world. And her thought was, it can't be that some of them are right and some are wrong. That's not how biology works, and that's not how personality traits work. It must be that there's some evolutionary biological advantage to having both extroverted fish and introverted fish. And she thought about that, and she realized the extroverted fish were out finding more food, and so they were surviving, but they were also getting eaten more by larger fish, and so that there was a trade-off. The introverted fish were surviving, but sometimes starving, and so her thought was, if you have both types, you're going to have a stronger prospect for that organization. We can think of it as it flourishing. And so I like to think about the interpretive side of public opinion that way, that we benefit from different points of view. And so I try to encourage my own students to think critically and creatively. I try to teach them how to think, but never what to think.
Hmm. That kind of takes me to, because you talked about the different points of view, something that a lot of leaders are grappling with right now is that they and their teams really see the value of inclusion and diversity in the workplace, or really thinking about that with their customers or their stakeholders. And at the same time, there's a lot of backlash around that topic, around acronyms like DEI and ESG right now. And they're trying to figure out how to navigate those choppy waters. And I'm wondering if you could kind of share some perspective on how you might advise approaching that based on this research.
I think that there's a tendency for people in a lot of organizations to want to keep replicating the current form of the organization on into the future. And I think that's self-defeating because that forecloses our opportunity to incorporate the new points of view that will help us grow and achieve new things. So from my world, this happens all the time in academic hiring where a professor leaves for another university or retires, and the hiring department has to think, do we want to replace that person who left with somebody exactly like that person, or do we want to get the best person we can, no matter what their particular research interests are? And I'm always a champion for the second perspective because we should always want the best people we can with the newest, most interesting views, because they will not just do their job, they will elevate the rest of us in doing our jobs. And so I welcome diversity of all forms, because that means that we have all forms of new perspectives being pumped into the organization. I think we all gain from that.
Yeah, it's something that you and I talked about before along those lines was, when we think about a challenge like this, like, let's use diversity as an example. I think the way you kind of challenged me to think about it was, is the goal a value or is the goal an outcome? And I'd love for you to say more about that, if I'm remembering that that right, because I thought that was a good perspective.
So, I mean, there's an interconnection between values and outcomes. It, we should want, I think, as a matter of value, we should have certain things that we want to prioritize, and there are innate reasons, there are intrinsic reasons for wanting to do that, but those tie to our outcomes. If if you're running a business and you have a wide customer base, then you should value the form of constructing your business that will appeal to that wide customer base. So I see them as interconnected.
Yeah. And I think, as we think back to what you were talking about of fact versus, belief, if you're going for an outcome, for example, you could use specific evidence to, factually prove that there's an advantage versus if it's a value, it may be, if it's more of a value judgment, that's an opinion, right? And so saying, well, this is a good thing is not, there might be a disagreement on that. And I don't know, I just found that your research and what we talked about in kind of opinion versus fact and people's interpretation, I could see how that could, be used to sort of slice and dice the way that people might approach even a really sticky challenge like that one, and not just the, does do green and do blue and yellow make green, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this happens among serious-minded people in Congress on congressional committees all the time, and I'm sure it happens in boardrooms all the time, where first we need to agree on the facts. We need to be clear on what the facts are. If we can get clear on the facts and be in agreement on the facts, then the two or three or however many there are different perspectives that are being advanced can talk about why they interpret the facts the way they do and what end they hope to achieve given that factual foundation. But if we can't even agree on the facts in the first place, then the whole process gets short-circuited.
Yeah, 100%. So to switch gears for a second, and then we're going to come back a little bit to this, something that makes you unique, and we heard it in your bio, is in addition to being a political science professor and a researcher, you're a poet and a songwriter for children. And I wondered if you could just first, how did that all come to be? Because that is something that we wouldn't have necessarily expected for somebody just from your name and title. And I want to know a little bit about maybe what you've learned being in that world that we can relate back to what we were talking about before. But maybe just let's start with some of the background there.
Sure. It started, I guess, 30 years ago. It was 1994. I was teaching a summer program in Romania, and I was co-teaching it with a colleague whose 3-year-old son was with us. And we got checked in. We're staying in this apartment for a few weeks while we teach this course, and he had forgotten to bring his books. And so he turned to me and said, well, mom can't write. You need to start writing me something. And and so I took that as a challenge, and I tried each evening after he went to bed to write a new poem so that there was a new one waiting for him in the morning. And it took a few years before the things that I were writing were any good, but I kind of got hooked on it. And then my own kids were getting to that age. And so I kept at it and started writing more and more. And then the next thing you know, it's turned into quite a few poems and songs. A lot of the poems have been turned by musicians into songs that they've released.
So what have you learned about engaging with young people? Because I would think that doing this is really hard because my experience with, like, I just hung out with my 4-year-old nephew, the attention span is pretty short, and creating something that's going to be entertaining to a kid is I don't know. I would think it'd be actually a little harder than writing a research paper. So what have you learned from doing that?
Yeah, so I do mostly aim my poems and songs at children who are a little older than your nephew.
Yeah, four's tough. But yeah,
Yeah,
don't try for 4-year-olds, Jeff. Go higher.
Yeah, four's tough. 8, 9, 10-year-olds are what I aim for, and so I really like that age because they're very creative and they're sort of unrestrained in their creativity. Nobody's telling them don't do it that way, and so I just try to harness it a tiny bit by talking about rhyme and meter, and then let their ideas run. And so we take some of my poems where it's possible to add some lines to it and do these brainstorming sessions where we try to come up with new ways that we could expand on the poem. And then when I talk to the students, sometimes they'll say things that will cause me to go off and write something the next day. One evening I was at a writer's event in Missouri, and we're in this big gym, and it wasn't my turn yet. And this young girl, she's about 9 years old, sat down, and I didn't know her, she didn't know me, and she said, something terrible happened to me last night. And I said, oh no, what happened? Do you want to talk about it? And she said, yeah, I'll talk about it. I'm out at dinner with my brother, my sister, my mom, my dad. We're at the pizza place, we're enjoying ourselves. And then I looked at the next table, and there's my teacher. And I said, was that a problem? Yeah, that's a problem. Oh, well, do you like your teacher? Yeah, I love my teacher. She's wonderful. I just don't want to see her outside of school. And so I ended up writing a poem called I Saw My Teacher at the Beach that got turned into a song and played on the radio and everything. And I would have never thought of that. It wouldn't have occurred to me that it was odd to see your teacher outside of school. But as soon as she said it, I could see that from her perspective. And then it generated this idea. And so that being open to having a communication with somebody who I hadn't met 2 minutes earlier turned into this really fun poem and song.
Oh, that's great. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I know you teach poems or poetry to the kids around that age too, and you have some lessons, I guess, for how to actually get them to stay engaged with you and pay attention. Can you talk about that?
So I, children like rhyme and they like rhythm. And so I focus on that. I adjust the lessons depending upon the age of the students because they can be anywhere from 6 or 7 up to 13 or 14. But the more I can pull them into the process and make it interactive, the more successful it seems to be. Nothing makes me happier when I visit a school than hearing the students down the hall an hour later singing one of the songs that we went over, or reciting one of the poems, or coming up to me by the end of the day with a poem that they've written, because it meant that this connected somehow. I think I have an advantage relative to people who write prose because they're really sponges for poetry, especially if they're funny as mine tend to be and they have rhyme and meter. So I I I find it very fulfilling. It's just a blast visiting schools doing these poetry lessons and exercises.
I'm wondering, some of the lessons that you're sharing from, working with young people and, the two-way kind of interaction and, finding entertaining ways. Seems like there might be some lessons that could be applied to either your work as an educator of college students, or I don't know, even maybe when we're thinking about engaging with the public, like you have explored in political behavior and psychology. So is there I don't know. Is there a connection there? Are there lessons that maybe we can learn and apply?
Well, I think the worst thing that a professor could probably do is think they know everything. And I just wrapped up this semester, had my last class on Tuesday, and one of the things I said to the students was that I really enjoyed the semester. As is usually the case, I am positive that I learned as much or more than any of you did because you heard from me. I got to hear from 90 of you, and it expanded my perspectives. They shared new information with me, and so I think anybody, even if you're in a leadership position, you have to be open to the input. You can't be all about expressing the way you want things to be done without realizing that the people you've surrounded yourself with, they have great ideas too. And so and I really mean this when I talk to my students. I mean, they set off so many, they flip so many switches in my mind about new ideas, new things that I could pursue with research into the future because they're smart, they're creative, and they have completely different points of view than I do in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to this point that I've heard from some other folks, but you're sharing it in a different perspective that if you want to influence other ways, other folks, you have to allow them to influence you. It has to be two-way. Influence can't just be one way. And whether it's the 8-year-old that you're teaching poetry to or the college students, creating that environment where they're allowed to influence you and you want to learn from them doesn't just help you, it actually makes them more open to what you have to teach them and what you have to share. Is that right?
If I'm influencing anybody, and I don't really think of myself in those terms, but if I'm influencing anybody, the influence I want to have is to get them to employ both critical and creative skills. And if they do that, so I'm not trying to reach any particular objective. I don't want them to think that this particular thing is true or to learn this particular point. I want them to engage information, engage decision making better. And if they do that and they communicate back to me, then yeah, I've benefited from it.
Yeah.
We all have.
Yeah, 100%. I wonder if you could just share a quick story as we close. I know that your knowledge of the music industry kind of influenced the way you think about our political system. It sort of sparked a creative idea around that. And I wondered if you could talk about that.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
I'm thinking the Billboard 100 specifically, and how that made you think about term limits.
Oh, well, okay. So I didn't know where you were going. My sons actually are both professional jazz musicians, and so I'm sort of immersed in music because of that, which was me really enjoying music and writing lyrics and then raising them on it, and then they turned into these very successful jazz musicians. But yeah, I way back in graduate school, I had to do a mathematical modeling paper, and it could be about anything, even though it was a political science course. And I made the argument in my mathematical modeling paper that the way the Billboard Hot 100 worked was effective for helping us retain good quality songs for the long haul. There are a lot of songs that become hits for a week or two and they drop off and we forget them. But the ones that stick it out for many weeks end up becoming classics and we all can sing along to them in the car. So then term limits became a topic of conversation. And I thought if we had term limits, we would be truncating how many times voters could review a given candidate. We would be saying, no matter how good or bad you are, it doesn't matter. We're kicking you out because you've hit the term limit. And so I applied the mathematical to that, and I gathered some data. And the conclusions were, one, voters are pretty good at screening out the real clunkers. So there are a lot of people who get elected to Congress and they serve for a term or two, but they get found out and voters vote them out. And so most of them don't last. So by the time you hit 12 years, 6 terms, which is what most term limits proposals advocate, the net quality in terms of the competence and integrity of the people we have retained because they've survived 6 elections is pretty good. And kicking them out at that point is just utterly irrational. Political scientists don't agree on very many things, but one of the things they agree on is that term limits don't make any sense. Why would you have a voter purposely keep this member of Congress for 12 years and then not have the opportunity to keep them anymore? It doesn't make any sense. If they're not doing a good job, vote them out. Don't just kick them out because of how long they've been there. And I would never have thought of that application had I not done the Billboard Hot 100 paper in the first place.
Yeah, I love that as an unlikely source of inspiration because I've heard many arguments for and against term limits, and I've never heard about it that way. And it just kind of shows the value of finding inspiration in other places. And obviously, you're at the top of your game when it comes to your research and the teaching you do, and then you've decided to only do things that you can do very well, maybe, or build up to that, because even in the children's songwriting and poetry, you have gotten wide acclaim, and it's fun that you were able to kind of develop a theory that brought those worlds together.
So I think it's important for all of us to when we see what look like they might be obstacles to try to figure out how those can become opportunities, and that involves thinking creatively about them. When you introduced me, you mentioned my first book was called Nothing to Read: Newspapers and Elections in a Social Experiment. Book came out in 1995, but the research was in 92. I was in my first year as a professor. I just completed my PhD, and I had a grant to do a study of the 1992 elections. And I was at the University of Pittsburgh at the time. And then the city of Pittsburgh's newspapers went on strike in May of 92, and they did not publish again until January of 1993. So we went through the entire election without newspapers. And I was despondent for a little bit. And then it occurred to me that this is a perfect opportunity to study if newspapers matter. Take them away and see if upon taking them away, it changes anything. And so I gathered data half in Cleveland, which is demographically very similar to Pittsburgh, and they had their newspapers, half in Pittsburgh, and was able to turn what looked like a real problem for my research agenda into a really fun and interesting project. And so that just keeping open-minded about the world as it unfolds in front of you, and thinking how you can benefit in terms of learning something new as events develop. I think that's just critical for all of us.
And I have to ask, what did you find?
Well, I found that in a sense, it did not matter a whole lot that the Pittsburgh newspapers went on strike, because the people who would be reading a newspaper, remember this is before the internet, the people who were reading the newspaper for their news were the sorts of people who were the most motivated to be informed about the election. And so they were able to go out and find substitute information by reading the New York Times or by reading national magazines. So they were able to compensate it for the absence of newspapers. The one place it mattered was at the local level, because nothing else covers local politics the way newspapers do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The presidential campaign or whatever, they can get their information elsewhere, but there was nobody reporting on those local council meetings where the really important stuff happens.
It was actually kind of funny, because I talked to people at the local television stations, and they said that they wanted to fill in the gap because the newspapers were absent, except where they got a lot of their news for the local TV broadcast was by reading the newspaper, and they didn't know how to gather the information on their own.
Wow.
And then they started doing some weird things trying to compensate for the lack of newspapers, like running the classified ads at the end of each little news segment before it cut to commercial. They would run, who was having a garage sale or what were the movie listings. And the strangest, maybe creepiest, was they started running scrolling obituaries on the screen. But so they were trying to figure out how to adapt to the information environment they found themselves in.
Wow. That's cool. Well, I'm going to remember that story because I'm a former newspaper man myself. So I love that example. Well, Jeffrey, I really appreciate you spending time with us today. Um, your research is really important. A little worrisome, I think, but it certainly gives us some lessons as leaders within our own organizations to kind of remember the training that we sometimes have to do to help people know the difference between a fact and an opinion. We can't take that for granted. And I think as a society, knowing that, we got to make sure young people learn those things. I think some of us, you and I, were probably both fortunate enough to have teachers that taught us that stuff when we were younger, but we need to think about what we have to do with others. And so some really great lessons that we took away. And thank you for spending time with us.
Anthony, thank you for having me on the show. It's been very enjoyable talking with you about it. It's interesting to me that it was interesting to you, so it's kind of a win-win, hopefully.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time,